Hello and welcome to today's much belated episode of Monarchism Unfiltered. I'm one of your hosts, McCosk,
I'm Iam.
This is me, Bronze.
and on today's episode, we're going to talk about the state of education, primarily in the West.
Yeah, because I haven't gone to a Chinese education system or any kind of East Asian. Any. I'm Western.
I did.
Western.
I've only been to one university, so
Yeah, I've been to two
Yeah.
universities, so I don't know. Like, I'm slightly more advanced over you, but yeah.
they're all in Britain.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah.
I think the first thing. I think the first thing that we should talk about is, as always, the decline of the West, and specifically the decline of, I think, academia and trade, like specifically the way in which we're taught. Because I think, I don't know how much other people here have studied this, but because I'm interested in like late Platonism, or late Neoplatonism, as you want to call it. And a lot of Proclus's ideas. I'm quite interested in education and like educational theory in the medieval world. And one of the interesting things that you always sort of observe there is that they had a far more holistic understanding of what you should learn. So at least in the UK, you specialize basically from the age of 16. Even arguably from the age of 14, which is an incredibly early age to specialize, where if you compare this to in the Middle Ages, probably the primary thing you would have been learning as a child would have been languages. You would have been, if you were in proper education, you would have been learning Latin and Greek. That's the main thing you would have learned. Or you would have been in some kind of apprenticeship if you were doing technical learning. And for sort of higher academic learning, after sort of this basic learning of languages, you would be, and contemporary to it, you'd be taken through the quadrividium, which is the sort of four basic liberal arts, and sort of in brief outline, that the quadrividium is so the quadrividium is mathematics, geometry, or arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, as taught after the trivium, which is grammar, logic, rhetoric, which would be later on when people didn't have inherent, childhood understandings of maths and Latin, or Greek and Latin, would include the teaching of Greek and Latin. And then after that, you would be taught, medicine, architecture, philosophy, theology, so on and so forth. And the basics of this comes out of Plato, but it's sort of very much elaborated by Proclus more than anyone else in his commentaries on the Republic. And I think it's interesting to see how, if we compare this kind of holistic focus on education, including astronomy, to what we have now, we essentially now have like hyper specialization from a very early age, and then also the kinds of education that is done focuses mainly upon very practical things. So it's mathematics is aimed at is not really aimed at, it's not paired with musical theory or astronomy, and it's kind of, in this sense it is quite abstract, actually, I think is probably the best term.
That what I am here is saying is not that, we should abolish all practical education and replace it by woolly theoretical understanding of education. What he is saying is that, and although there has been some pushback on the field towards what we're saying here in the past few years, is that the progress of academia in the West led to an unsustainable, really, amount of specialization in fields to the point that they became unworkable. Some of my teachers used to complain, and for reference, I took political sciences, about how back in the well, not even back in their day, but back when they're students, and considering the average age of my professor was very young. Some of them went from student to teacher the year after they finished their studies. So back in their day, it does not mean that long ago. The common story was how interdisciplinarity, the cooperation between two different disciplines, was like almost mandatory by this point, because the fields individually themselves had basically stagnated, if not plateaued. So in a way, what we're saying is not necessarily that radical either, or tradical, I suppose, in any effective capacity. Really, we're just stating that it's gotten too specialized to the point that it doesn't really work anymore. We're no longer taught how to live and how to be citizens, even in the so vaunted civic education of republics. We're just taught to basically fill forms and work.
Yeah.
And sorry, what did you want to say?
Yeah, no, it's just branched out so often. Like you'll read the preamble to a book, and it'll say, "Oh, yeah, this was this guy. Yeah, this guy is is a historian, economist, sociologist, and socioanthropologist." Which just a few decades ago, all of what he would be doing would be covered under the term historian. Like it's like he's become a one-man interdisciplinary study group.
Yeah.
I mean, also, I think you see this in general with how the term philosophy has changed quite a bit. And obviously, I think you also see this with the difference between like Greek episteme, which is, or Arabic ilm, or even Latin scientia, compared to modern understandings of what science means, or Scientia or Wissenschaft, so on and so forth, where the science basically now means empirical understanding of applied to the natural world, where episteme, from where we derive the term, in Aristotle explicitly means just organized knowledge. So neither he nor Plato would have considered empirical, quote unquote, science to actually be science, because of the fact that the senses can deceive us. This is a point that Plato makes in the Phaedo, actually. He quite explicitly thinks that real knowledge, like that there is a distinction between things that we can perceive and things that are understandable, even if what is understandable has underlying it these intelligibles. And I think the fact then that that we've had this kind of very harsh shift to empirical understanding has led to a kind of particularism where we focus upon quote unquote more practical activities, which I think largely actually makes life much worse. I mean, in the UK, you're essentially asking 16-year-olds to choose what they want to do with their life, which, yeah, like 16-year-olds generally don't know what they want to do with their life. It seems fairly silly to ask that of them.
Nevertheless, you have them do a test that's supposed to determine your aptitudes, which, needless to say, I did mine. It gave me hard sciences. I failed massively, and then I found my calling in political sciences.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's those kinds of, I mean, you see this even with like, I think you see this like dominance or tyranny um, of empiricism with things like empirical psychology. I mean, it's quite ridiculous, I think, the way in which we have, I mean, anyone here can go and check the reproducibility rates of most experimental psychology. And it's like between 15 and 25%. So it's essentially just not actually a science in general, because it's not even basically systematic. It's these kinds of tests, like you do a 20-page pamphlet, and then that spits out some result of what you are likely to be. And most people ignore that because it's usually, it's as good, if probably worse, than just doing like a astrology chart, basically. And at least with the astrology chart, there's some kind of systematic mathematics underlying that, which psychology and those kinds of psychology does not really. It's this completely, yeah.
This being said, again, we're not saying that psychology should be abolished because it isn't scientific. In fact, a good point of this is because this pressure to be scientific, to be systematized, etc., 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 puts a pressure and ultimately constrains knowledge and understanding. Knowledge and understanding do not necessarily have to be A, replicable, or B, systematized. Essentially, the point being made here is not that psychology should be abolished because it isn't scientific, is that psychology shouldn't, in other comparable fields, shouldn't be forced to be scientific in nature.
Yeah, I think I think in many cases, the demand for systematicity is at direct conflict with the empirical method, as Plato and Aristotle believed. I think it's also interesting then to consider the way in which what is actually expected of students has become much less. There's a degree to which I think, and you see this especially at the level of universities, because universities have kind of commodified themselves, especially
before you go on, I would just like to clarify a thing because it could be misunderstood. When we say not scientific, we don't mean not rigorous, as in like just make up whatever you want. Like it should still be carefully studied, but in a different way.
Yeah. I mean, I fully agree there. I think also there is this kind of there is definitely a conflation of rigor and science. People talk about the rigor of the hard sciences, which is, I think, fairly a bit of a joke, largely, especially if you look at like the history of biology, or like the way that people understand a lot of chemistry, where it's kind of like it. For a long time, they just like didn't have causal explanations for most of chemistry. They just, because there was no, like, I mean, even sort of stuff like bonding and how the properties of molecules seems to have, as in many cases, seems to have no real connection with the base like components of atoms that are combined. That is, yeah, it is kind of funny then that there is this extreme claim to, especially when you look at how chemists, since the Romantic movement, have violently attacked any kind of like pro alchemy positions within like literature or romanticism, this is actually one of the most interesting stories about empirical science, is that when they discovered that you could change elements, like at very high intensities of energy, the two people that had discovered this, I think it was the professor said to the PhD student basically, "Oh, we need to cover this up because they'll think that we're claiming alchemy, because transmutation of like base metals into gold and so forth," which I always find quite a funny story.
Tangentially related to what I am, as said, I would like to remind, and indeed fact, a public service announcement, that we, humanity, do not know how glue works.
Yeah.
That is true. We are not aware of, or why ice is slippery.
To a certain temperature.
Well, no, because it should freeze.
Still foiling us.
Yeah. No, I mean, they're important questions, and it's kind of, and I think that this focus on the empirical just sort of harms this hyper focus. I think I should be able to use.
It narrows the focus to a point it's completely unworkable and frankly unproductive. I mean, although I don't have a particular experience with this, I did know a lot of people and heard from other people that, especially the higher up you get into the university, I'm not yet, or perhaps ever, going to take a master's or a doctorate. But doctorate and master students did often complain how they kept doing these literally pointless and meaningless hyper-specific papers that amounted to nothing, and how that was in of itself quite soul-crushing.
And I think that brings us well into points about university and like university education. And I think one of the most interesting things, or sort of one of the first things to say about university, is that how the commercialization of university has, I think, largely contributed to a weakening of standards. So if you look at just kind of what is expected of most students, outside of a couple fields like mathematics, at least in the top universities, students are not actually pushed all that much. They're like, the readings will be difficult, maybe. If you are enthused about your course, it would be completely fine.
Make it seem like being enthused for one's course is a normal occurrence these days, sadly.
Yeah, I mean, that's also a point to be made. I think that, and I think a lot of this extends from that, at least in places like the UK, and I think to a degree in America, with the way that student loans work, though it's quite different there. It's basically just being used to like pump money into like urban renewal programs, because students keep house prices up because they rent. And I think if you look at, just sort of the sheer laziness of like a lot of students, I think Bronze could talk about like the laziness of PPE students at great length.
Yeah, I think I could come up with some good examples, but it's certainly not unique to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're a good example just because it's.
PPE students and engineering students are the ones that are most often mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, because PPE is like, oh, I don't know what I want to be, so I don't want to specialize too much, and then they're just often not very interested in like the entirety of the subject. I mean, the funniest person that I've ever met at university was a mathematics student who, like, in sort of the first week was refused to like talk about his course. And I was just thinking, like, how is it possible for someone to be doing mathematics and not want to do their course? Like, you don't get into any university to do maths and don't care about it. Like, it was a very strange interaction that I had with this guy.
I mean, strangely enough, there's quite I've known a few people actually who've fitted that description of, like, well, perhaps they do want to talk about it, but they, like, when they get in, like, they don't really care about maths, right? But these are usually people who either didn't do much in secondary school, or if it's like a hard to get into university, they didn't have to do much. They managed to get good results without working very hard, as often happens. And then they didn't know what to pick for uni, but they definitely wanted to go because they didn't want to work a trade, and they were expected to go to uni. And a lot of them pick maths because it's just something. And then those people usually end up being either the worst or best at maths. It's very strange phenomenon.
Also, to add to this conversation, although we are focusing a lot on like the lack of requirements on some students in some fields, let's admit we don't have the most encompassing experience among us. I personally believe that there are courses that do push their students to the extreme. Others that they barely register if the students are there. But I think we should also draw some focus onto the teachers, because at least this is my personal experience. The feeling was that often we didn't finish the program, which I've been told is actually the norm these days. That the teacher was barely interested in actually teaching, and those that were interested in teaching rarely were interested in teaching in the subject matter. The truth of the matter is that many university teacher these days is simply concerned, well, at least in continental Europe, is interested in just publishing review articles for indexed peer-reviewed.
I believe in you.
Oh, come on! I'm not.
Journals.
It's journals. God damn it! Peer-reviewed journals rather than actually teaching. So that also contributes to the lackening of standards due to commercialization, since it's via the publishing of articles in indexed journals that universities get their ranking, and that's kind of important as a bargaining chip for funding or for just attracting more students, what have you.
Yes, and that takes place in two forms. Either someone who ends up being hired because of their abilities as a great researcher, or someone who is interested in teaching, but then ends up having more and more of their time being spent on writing and research, because that's the main priority these days.
Publish or die. Publish or die, which is the watchword now.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Publish or die.
Yeah. All this, and I believe now, dear listener, you might be a bit stunned on what could have possibly brought such a topic to Monarchism Unfiltered. It's not typically something. So it's the first time we've actually discussed the education or something so institutional and rather.
No, it isn't. We've talked about education before.
No, we've talked about education, but we've talked about it in almost ethereal capacity, not so tied to the here and now. And basically, I'm trying to segue.
It was one of the questions in the first Q&A.
Oh, fucking damn it! I have a goddamn horrible memory. In either case, this is me trying to clumsily segue into the interdimensional Teichmüller theory paper that came across us a couple of days ago.
Yeah. So yeah, I've heard about the Interuniversal Teichmller theory paper from a couple of friends that do maths. Because this paper is a whopper. and we've been talking about it and how it's something.
I mean, seeing as you probably know the most mathematics here, could you explain the basic details of it, Bronze?
No, I've tried. Okay.
Do you want to try again?
Well, I mean, like the interuniversal stuff. I'm not. That is something, else.
To give Bronze some time to think out, I'll give some context. This paper isn't famous amongst those who do maths and really anyone with the ability to read once it comes across them, because it's made by one Japanese dude whose name escapes me, who has been publishing and quotes himself in his own research paper, mind you, various papers like this, in which the main debate is not whether to prove him right or wrong, is to actually understand him. Because what is being written is almost impenetrable to anyone.
Anyone being the sample of 3 mathematicians that I personally know. I just want to make that clear. In case we get 20 comments saying, "Oh, I've read it and I understand it perfectly clearly," and it's
in case we do get someone saying that, please write at least a short description of what it says via email or post it in the comments. Humanity has to know.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean it has to do with like the properties of topological spaces. So it's like like stuff that is shapes. I'm sounding really dumb right now. I promise. Right, there's the. You see, this is the problem. I'm not a mathematician, but there is the spaces, and then spaces have properties, and then that has implications.
But we bring up this, it was this incomprehensible paper that did kind of bring us to that did kind of inspire us on today's episode of like, okay, but this is overly specialized that it is unpenetrable to everyone. Like it is, and this comes back to the topic of the decline of the West that was passively mentioned at the
By the way, we don't want to single out the guy who wrote the paper because I mean it's like a very theoretical aspect of maths, and obviously it's going to be complicated.
We're not saying he is like the worst. We're saying that per chance it was his curiously named paper that inspired the discussion. But like the increasing complexity and like basically humanity, and this is a very personal claim. On this rare moment, I speak for myself and myself alone. So we can avoid another dialectical materialist situation. I think that the decline of the West is in good part related to the fact that simply education, like human technical understanding, well, not even technical in this context, but just human understanding is actually regressing rather than progressing. Because a lot of this theory that is being discussed, a lot of these understandings, and again, mentioning a hyper-theoretical paper as the previous exploration, it doesn't really help my point. But a lot of the theory and actual development that is currently happening in sciences does not actually filter back to the wider populace. It is, in fact, seems due to its hyper-specification, lack of reference in other fields or other models of understanding, it has become wholly esoteric and impenetrable, even to those starting in the field. But anyone outside of it, it becomes even worse. This is having, at least again, in my personal opinion, the actual impact of actually reducing average human understanding and knowledge as opposed to actually increasing it. I mean, for a good example of what a thing that used to be done but is no longer, medieval universities, for example, used to have summas in which they just published summaries of whatever new knowledge had been uncovered. I'm not exactly familiar with the what were the intervals, but they used to publish such summas for as public as it was back then, I suppose, to whomever was interested to read as a way of disseminating knowledge. such efforts, if they are done in such an obtuse and unreachable level that I'm not familiar with them.
Yeah, and I think this connects with the point I was making at the start about how sort of our epistemic ideals have changed quite a bit. Where if you look sort of even 100 years ago, prior to the Enlightenment, the basic aim or desire was for a kind of comprehensive knowledge. And I mean, this is most clearly expressed in in literature with works like Robinson Crusoe or the works of Ibn Tufayl, where it is the perfect man, the highest man, is one who is like a polymath, who has this kind of comprehensive knowledge, and this is what is sort of argued for in works like The Republic by Plato, that you really need to have comprehensive knowledge. And it seems to me basically that this kind of aim for holistic or comprehensive knowledge has been replaced with a desire for incredibly specialized knowledge. So it's like things like learn to code is the catchphrase. It's not sort of try to understand the principles of mathematics or something more fundamental, more universal. It is focus upon tiny sections of whatever you're interested in, and yeah, this is most acute, I think, in philosophy, physics, and mathematics.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say I think it's less bad in some other social sciences.
But some economics papers start getting very, but they're not, on this level, But because what's interesting with maths and physics is that in the last couple of decades, and really ongoing as we speak, there's been a radical transformation in how those two fields interact with each other. That, because it used to be for the longest time that discoveries in mathematics led to discoveries in physics because mathematical principles could be applied to the physical world. And now that has changed because with stuff like quantum field theory, some of the physics has gotten so abstract that discoveries in physics are now leading to discoveries in maths.
Yeah, that is.
But that's not the fault of anyone in particular. That's just how the sciences evolved. So I don't think that's really a problem area as much.
The main concern here is that it's the focus has shifted from concept understanding to concept remembering. Just use the formula to solve the issue. Bada bing, bada boom. What does the formula actually do to the numbers? Who cares?
Yeah, at least in the in the lower levels. Obviously, if you're dealing with like Interuniversal Teichmiller theory, like you got to know what the stuff does.
Obviously, I'm not. Again, yeah. I'm not here implying that I'm not here implying that.
The problem isn't with the maths and the physics. It's right that that is very complex. It's with how it's taught, and that usually when arriving in higher education, students have not been prepared very well how to think about maths.
Any field in particular.
Yeah, right. Because you might these are the formulas. This is the quadratic formula. But like there's very little time. I think in further maths, which not all schools offer, there was like one module explaining proofs. The basis of how we achieve understanding of mathematics. And it was, there's like one small chapter discussing how it is that we know anything in maths and how we can, and the principles of, how anything can be known to be mathematically true.
A comparable example in the humanities would be the history of colonialism.
I think also, sorry to say, I think one of the interesting things, at least with like proofs in mathematics, is like the way in which things like Gödel's theorem have been misunderstood. So yeah, I mean, Gödel's theorem is obviously very famous, but basically they just say that for any formal system of mathematics that could be created, deduced, whatever, there will always be something that can't be, some part of mathematics that cannot be understood within the terms of that formal system. So basically, any attempt to completely formalize mathematics will inevitably fail. Now, what's interesting about that is that has been taken by many philosophers and people interested in mathematicians interested in philosophy to be kind of like a disproof of the ability to like systematize anything really. Whereas, so I mean, this is like if you read Gödel, Escher, and Bach, by I can't remember the author's name, he basically reads it in this manner. Gödel understood it basically as a proof of metaphysics, that you can't, and in the long form, a proof of God, basically, which I think is
by
very
Hofstadter.
Douglas Hofstadter, yeah. And I think that's a very interesting contrast to think about, that Gödel basically took it to be, it is not possible to do these kinds of formalizations because mathematics is grounded in metaphysics, whereas the usual interpretation has been kind of precisely the opposite interpretation. And I think that's a quite interesting contrast to think about.
To continue on from this point, I think that another thing, especially in humanities, and I kind of want to hear you two's thoughts on this. Natural philosophy, should it return, yay or nay?
I mean, I think natural philosophy definitely should return. I think the way in which physics, like the reason I think that natural philosophy should return is because of Kuhn's work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, because I think that there's an important point that he points out, which is that the result that he points out is that if we take the implicit metaphysics of most modern science seriously, the result is, as like interpreted through a broadly Kantian lens, the basic result is that at a scientific level, the alchemists kind of just were right, and for their time period, and so what was true for the alchemists is not true now, and what is true now was not true then. And I think the only reasonable way to maintain this position, which is quite a popular position within philosophy of science, though people have issues with it, is the concept of natural philosophy. I think only through natural philosophy as the idea that we can understand the natural world pre-empirically without necessary reference to empirical results. Basically, that is how we would be able to derive some kind of unity to the history of our understanding of the natural world. And if we don't have that kind of unity, we are then forced into a situation where, we can't really say that people were wrong before us, which is a very difficult and also, I think more important,
also unhelpful.
Yeah, it's unhelpful, and then sort of more fundamentally, what that often results in basically is, if we think about the fact that it is likely that the empirical science of yesterday was wrong, there's no reason to suggest that the empirical science of today is correct. So it seems to me basically that something like natural philosophy is the only way to make sure that we have understanding of the world that is not sort of completely opaque and doesn't sort of collapse at the first sign of disproof.
Well, that answers my question.
I don't know, what, Bronze, do you have much of an opinion on natural philosophy?
No, I mean, I agree with what you said, that it's like a reasonable response to scientific anti-realism.
Yeah, and I think because scientific anti-realism is, I mean, even within Anglo-American philosophy, which is very pro-science, is a fairly popular position, basically for the reasons, I mean, almost to the point that I think the two primary positions within Anglo-American philosophy is basically some kind of Kuhnianism or scientific anti-realism, basically. I mean, there's structural realists who have very bizarre views, Relations without relata, Everything Must Go by James Ladyman. But I think those kinds of views are just a bit bizarre, and I don't think. But I mean, I think that it is interesting just at the level that there is a degree to which they seem to be trying to resurrect some kind of natural philosophy, even if it is very strange views, and that I think will ultimately be a good thing, if we try and understand the world, the cosmos, whatever, in a set, like, super empirical manner, I think is the best word, that includes empirical results but is not bound necessarily to it. So I think that's something that's necessary. I mean, Mikosky, I don't know what your opinion on that is.
And really, my only commentary would be something to the effect of, I wouldn't go with super empiric. I would go with coherent, useful, and functioning.
Yeah, coherent. Yeah, I think coherent's a good term. I think also, to sort of circle back around to academia itself, you were mentioning Diane, or we were talking about that, and I think the fact that that university has become commercialized, the reasons why there is this very heavy emphasis on publishing, because it's measurable, basically, where like quality is not, and I think that's a core reason. I think Bronze is completely correct there, because grant money comes through that kind of thing. I think, yeah.
We're close to wrapping up, but I would like to touch on a topic that only came to my mind now, which is some amongst our viewers, but it's also a concern no matter where you go. The politicization of it's kind of weird if we talked about academia and its issues and not talk about its politicization. And if I'm allowed to give again, and again, another rare moment in this podcast where I spoke only for me at this moment. I don't know if the rest of the hosts will agree with me, but I think concerns about the politicization of academia are either A, a liberal cope, or B, a liberal psyop.
In the field that that I'm most familiar with, which is I guess it would be both economics and history, but in economics, right, there is only one major school of economic thought that holds themselves to be not like an objective school of economic thought, and that's neoclassical synthesis, which in my own non-liberal, non-coping way, I am not afraid to admit is very cringe. See episode 18.
Yes, because a large issue with the politicization of academia comes from, let me put it like this, dear listener, and perhaps some of the conclusions here might encourage a degree of soul searching, but it is the height of liberalism to believe that the apolitical exists in any effective or observable capacity. To translate into more monarchical terms, the king is not apolitical, he is supra-political. But what is supra-political is still defined by the political, essentially, is the logic here. From this small clarification, let's circle back to the core topic. The politicization of academia is essentially a dog whistle from either left, right, Republicans, whomever, to try and control the discourse. Because it presupposes that there exists such a thing as unbiased education to begin with. As you may have noticed before in various episodes, I hold that the education of history, specifically of colonial history, is horrifically biased in the sense that it's not even begins to be taught, let alone a lot of the atrocities committed by the colonial empires is basically put beneath the rug and stomped until it's an even surface. And that causes tremendous lapses of understanding and comprehension amongst the Western populace in general. I mean, Jesus Christ, I've seen recently person defending that, saying that the British atrocities committed in India were propaganda, the Bengal famine, propaganda. So to continue on my admittedly very ranty moment here, is that concerns about politicization in education are a dog whistle for people who don't actually care about education and just want to own insert group I don't like here. Because it will always be politicized down to the fucking core, because the apolitical doesn't exist, period. Every single way of teaching any single subject is biased from the outset because it assumes X, Y, Z theories. Heck, some entire fields are so biased from the outset that it renders them limited and dubious. Like a good example being music theory, for example. I said example 3 times, but still.
Yeah, there are many discussions you can have about like the very very subtly politicized nature of music theory, because you wouldn't think it's politicized, but what's the guy? Hold on. There's a guy that his last name is Yule. Anyway, Phil Yule, that's his name. I can link his paper in the description, and it's about how essentially a lot of Anglo-American, at least, music, but generally Western music theory is based around the ideas of one Heinrich Schenker, and how the sort of implications of his structure of music theory promote a racial ideology. But yeah, we don't usually think of music as something that is politicized.
I mean, the clear solution there is just to go back to Pythagorean music theory, seeing as they were all Greek, so black basically. But as we know, meds are not white, so just go back to the meds.
And never forget the glorious Hiberno-African race.
Exactly. Well, med, but like.
Yeah, no, and I don't want to speak for Minkowski, but as far as I'm aware, I don't think Minkowski is saying, oh, academics shouldn't give a shit about recognizing and combating their biases, because they absolutely should, but they shouldn't just claim they're not biased, because that, if anything, is the height of bias.
Yeah. Clearly, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to leave it at, especially I think because this links into clear issues around the degree to which Western academics claim themselves to be objective, even if they take quite particular views that often don't make much sense if considered within wider history. And yeah, I think it's.
I think there might be a follow-up to this in the non-determinate future.
Yeah, I think it's a good place to leave it. I've been one of your hosts. I am, and this has been Monarchism Unfiltered.
And I've been Bronze.
Kosk, do you want to sign off?
I did. Okay, again, I'm McCosk. This has been Monarchism Unfiltered.
Good night.
No, particularly.
Hello, well, the two of us are back again for the first time in MU history, where we've added a thing at the end.
Yes. This is essentially a disclaimer about the theory mentioned in the podcast episode, the Universal Teichmüller theory, in which basically we did a poor job of explaining it, and also feel slightly guilty for the way we treated it in the episode itself.
Yeah, this is a clarification and, if anything, a slight apology to Shinichi Mochizuki. And first of all, right, what Teichmüller theory is, as explained by an economist, so sort of, you're full economic historian. So you don't want to take my words for the maths, but essentially, it is a way of understanding. It's a new way of understanding arithmetic geometry, and if this model is true, I'm not actually going to get into what the model is because it's very complex and beyond me. Right, it would prove the ABC conjecture, which is a conjecture upon which a lot of other models would be explained. If the ABC conjecture would be proved, which it would if interuniversal Teichmüller theory is valid.
For those of us less math literate, or anything literate in these realms, such as I, what this would do was basically tell us a lot about triangles.
Among other things. It fundamentally tells us about number theory, but the number theory is useful to understanding triangles. But yeah, it would tell us some things about triangles.
In short, the theory is an attempt to solve an ages-long question that was first popped up in ancient Greece. So, in short, if it's a big deal, and although, again, as said in the episode, it was this particular study that prompted the discussion, we would like again to reinforce that Mr. Mochizuki and this paper are not an example of the problem, or even part of the problem. These are highly complicated matters.
Yeah, there wouldn't be a way to explain this in a simple way. And also a clarification on the comment about the mathematicians who haven't understood it. It's not that we understood none of it, because this is not our area and it's a very advanced paper. But those who actually do know what they're talking about understand all. Essentially, we didn't even understand why it could not be understood, because that's how little we understood it. But if you know what you're talking about and have an advanced knowledge of the maths involved, then almost all of the paper is quite clear. Well, sort of clear, because it's a very difficult paper, except there is one key part that is very hard to understand, and some have, and some are disputing its validity, and it's almost 100 pages in. So it is a hard to understand paper, but it's hard to understand for different and more reasonable and complex reasons than we didn't understand it. Because the reason we didn't understand it is because we have a complete lack of knowledge about the area of discussion of the paper. And we didn't want to make it sound like we're against papers on obscure topics, because if you knew us even a little bit, I don't feel that uncomfortable speaking for Mikkelsk and I am at this point, you would know that we are 100% fine with writing papers on sometimes very obscure and very hard to understand topics. Right? I didn't do a dialectical materialist moment, did I?
No.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
No, I agree. Again, you're talking to the guy who went fishing up for like papers and studies done on the East German economy at like 3 a.m.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, we're all into the obscure shit. That's why, Interuniversal Teichmiller theory was even a topic of conversation in the first place. Yeah. So this was our first post addendum and apology to Shinichi Mochizuki. Got it. Mochizuki. I should at least get his name right if I'm going to apologize to him.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's pretty much it, right?
Yeah. Seems about right.
Yeah. So see ya, and good night.